Today, we're jumping into the absolutely wild story of how Portugal, a tiny little kingdom on the edge of Europe with less than 1 million people, managed to sail halfway around the world and build a massive spice empire in India, an empire that would last for over 450 years.
And that's the big question, right? Think about it. We're talking about a country smaller than London at the time. How in the world did they manage to dominate the entire Indian Ocean and get a stranglehold on the planet's most profitable trade? How did they pull that off? Well, the short answer, as we're about to see, is a powerful three-punch combo. A revolutionary new sea route, some seriously superior firepower, and a clever, and pretty brutal, system of control. All right, let's get into it.
So first things first, why even go through all the trouble? It really boiled down to one thing: spices. Yes, spices. For centuries, this was the most profitable business on Earth, and Europe was absolutely desperate to get in on the action directly.
I mean, just look at this chart to get a sense of how lucrative we're talking. The cost to even get a voyage together was insane, a huge gamble. But the potential payoff from a cargo full of pepper, cinnamon, and clothes, it was astronomical. We were talking about returns on investment that would make a Silicon Valley venture capitalist's head spin. The Portuguese weren't just looking for a piece of the pie, they wanted the whole bakery.
And this number right here just says it all. When Vasco da Gama finally made it to India in 1498, the stuff he brought back sold for 60 times what the entire dangerous journey cost. A 60x return. That kind of profit doesn't just make you rich, it changes the world.
You know, what's funny is when da Gama first landed in Calicut, the local ruler, the Zamorin, he actually welcomed him. Why? Because for ages, Arab merchants had a total monopoly on the spice trade. The Zamorin saw these new guys from Portugal as a way to shake things up and break that monopoly. Little did he know, he was letting a tiger in the house that would soon try to eat everyone.
So the Portuguese had found the route, and they'd seen the mind-boggling profits. But how do you turn that into an actual empire? Well, they didn't just come to trade. They came to conquer the sea itself, using brand new naval tech and a string of brilliant and totally ruthless leaders. It was like they brought cannons to a sword fight.
The groundwork for this whole thing was really laid by 3 key guys. You had Francisco de Almeida, the strategist, Alfonso de Albuquerque, the guy who actually built the empire, and Nino de Cunha, the one who solidified it all. Let's break down what each of them did.
Almeida's big idea was something called the Blue Water Policy. He argued that Portugal didn't need to conquer huge chunks of land. His thinking was, if you control the sea, you control everything. And he proved it in 1509 at the Battle of Diu. His fleet, armed to the teeth with cannons, just obliterated a combined fleet from Egypt and India. That one battle cemented Portuguese naval power for 100 years. It was a total game changer.
But it was the next guy, Alfonso de Albuquerque, often called the real founder, who took the next crucial step. He knew they needed a permanent home base. So in 1510, he captured the island of Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur. Goa became the capital, the beating heart of Portuguese India for the next 4.5 centuries.
Okay, so they have total control of the sea and a strategic capital. Now the Portuguese roll out this unique system to enforce their monopoly. This wasn't just about winning battles anymore. It was about controlling every single ship that sailed in the Indian Ocean. They basically became the ocean's new landlords.
They did it with something called the Cartez system. And what was it? Honestly, it was a protection racket on an oceanic scale. The Portuguese just declared themselves the bosses of the sea. And if you wanted to sail and do business, you had to buy a license, a Cartez, from them. It was literally like paying a toll to use a highway, except the highway was the entire Indian Ocean.
So here's the nitty-gritty of how it worked. First, every single ship had to buy a pass. Simple enough. Second, that pass came with some big strings attached. You were forbidden from trading in high-value stuff like pepper, because the Portuguese wanted all of that for themselves. And third, what happened if you got caught without a license? Well, your ship was taken, your cargo confiscated, and you could be thrown in jail, enslaved, or just killed. The message was clear. You can trade here, but you do it by our rules.
And to make sure everyone followed those rules, they built a whole network of fortified trading posts they called factories. You can see on this timeline how fast they popped up, all along the coast. They were building a chain of forts to basically choke out any and all competition.
For almost a solid century, this system worked like a charm. Portugal was king. But, nothing lasts forever. By the early 1600s, other hungry European powers, especially the English and the Dutch, started showing up. and they were not interested in buying a cartaz. They brought their own cannons.
And when the decline started, it was fast. This timeline shows how quickly their empire started to crumble. In 1612, they lost the major port of Surat to the English. Then in 1632, the mighty Mughal Empire booted them out of Bengal. By 1663, the Dutch had snatched away their valuable forts on the Malabar coast. The sharks were in the water, and the Portuguese Empire was bleeding.
So why did it all fall apart so quickly? Well, as you can see here, it was a whole mix of things. On the outside, you had the English and the Dutch, who were just bigger, richer, and more powerful. But there were also huge problems at home. Their policy of forced religious conversions made a lot of enemies, their trade practices became super corrupt, and honestly, a small country like Portugal just didn't have enough people to run an empire that big. They had simply bitten off way more than they could chew.
So the Grand Ocean Empire collapsed. But the story doesn't quite end there. The Portuguese presence in India kept going for hundreds more years, just in a much, much smaller way. They went from being the kings of the sea to the caretakers of a few tiny plots of land.
By the end of the 1600s, that huge network of forts was gone. All they had left were 3 little pockets on the west coast: Goa, Daman, and Diu. This was the Estado da India, the state of India. Really, it was just the ghost of a once great empire.
And you're not going to believe how long they held on to just those little bits of land. The British Empire rose and fell in India, but the Portuguese were still there. It wasn't until this year, 1961, a full 14 years after India's independence, that the Indian government finally reclaimed these last territories.
And that brings us to this amazing historical fun fact. The Portuguese, the very first Europeans to show up and kick off the whole colonial era in India way back in 1498, were also the very last to leave in 1961. Their time in India spanned more than 450 years. To put that in perspective, that's almost twice as long as the United States has even existed as a country.
So, that leaves us with a final thought. This whole story is a wild ride, right? It shows how a small, hungry nation can use technology and a bit of ruthlessness to project incredible power across the globe. But it's also a serious cautionary tale about spreading yourself too thin and how quickly dominance can just disappear. It really makes you wonder, what lessons does this 450-year-old story hold for the world powers we see today?